Okay, so have you ever had one of those experiences that just kind of sticks with you? Well, I went to see this play this weekend called Arcadia, and it was just this whirlwind of like chaos theory and love and even landscape architecture
Yeah.
all packed into this really intricate story. And I got to tell you, by the time the curtain closed, like my brain felt like it had just run a marathon. It was exhilarating, but it also kind of got me wondering, like in this world of quick headlines and even quicker TikToks, are we like losing those mental muscles that we need to really do some deep reading and, really absorb complex information? And, since you, dear listener, are just as much of a learning enthusiast as I am, I knew we had to dive into this.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating question. You're definitely not alone in feeling that shift. There's this growing concern about how our engagement with information, especially books, might be changing.
Right. And it's not just like a hunch or anything, right?
Yeah.
That Atlantic article that you shared about those elite college students who are having trouble, reading that was really eye-opening. Like one student said they'd never even finished a single book in all of high school. It just kind of blows my mind.
Yeah, it's a pretty striking anecdote. It raises some red flags about what's going on in education these days. But I think what's even more concerning is that this isn't just limited to, those top-tier schools.
Exactly. This isn't like, an Ivy League problem.
Uh-huh.
It's way bigger than that. I mean,
Yeah.
you think about that Education Week piece and even Doug Lemmel's work, they all seem to be pointing toward this decline in book reading
Yeah.
across the board. And it's not just, statistics and studies. This is playing out in, like, homes just like mine. You know, my own son went through 2 full years of middle school without finishing one single assigned book.
And that's worrisome for a few reasons. You see, it's not just about like the sheer number of books that we're reading, but it's how this shift away from books might actually be impacting how we learn and process information.
Yeah, that's really getting to the heart of it. It's almost as if, like, the way we're consuming information is actually changing our brains themselves.
Exactly. And there's actually like some fascinating research to back that up. For example, cognitive scientist Daniel Willingham, he argues that our brains are like hardwired to learn most effectively through stories.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, think about it.
Hmm.
Stories, they engage us, they give us context, and they help us connect like emotionally to the information.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's like that feeling you get when you get totally lost in a good novel.
Hmm.
Suddenly you're not just like passively absorbing facts. You're actually experiencing the world through the character's eyes,
Hmm.
connecting with the narrative on this whole other level.
Exactly. And Doug Alimoff, he builds on this by pointing out that those aha moments, those flashes of insight we get while we're reading those, often happen when we're like really engrossed in a book.
Mm.
But here's where it gets even more interesting. There's this growing body of research suggesting that reading on paper, as opposed to screens, actually activates different parts of our brains.
Really? So it's not even just about like attention span. It's actually like impacting how our brains are wired. Tell me more about this research.
Okay, so one study found that when young children, they read physical books with an adult, there was way more brain activity in the areas associated with language and visual imagery. And this is compared to when they just listened to audiobooks or used, reading apps.
Wow. So there's something about that physical interaction then, like the turning of the pages, maybe even that like smell of a book that really deepens that learning experience.
Yeah, it seems that way. And it's not just, anecdotal evidence either. MRI scans of children between 8 and 12 years old, they've actually shown that those who preferred reading physical books had stronger reading circuits in their brains.
Wow.
Then there's a 2019 meta-analysis that looked at a ton of data and concluded that people, they just generally comprehend and retain information better when they read it on paper compared to reading on a screen.
Okay, wow. This is really making me rethink my own relationship with screens, I gotta
Yeah.
say.
And here's one more point that might surprise you. The Reboot Foundation, they did a study and found that fourth graders who mostly use tablets in their classrooms scored a full grade level lower on reading comprehension tests compared to their peers who rarely use them.
A full grade level? That's a huge difference.
Yeah.
It really kind of makes you think about how, even if you're reading the same words, just the way that you're reading them can really impact how well you get it.
It really is something to think about. It's like the difference between, looking at a picture of a beautiful landscape and actually like standing in that landscape and feeling the breeze and like smelling the air.
Yeah.
Both give you a glimpse, but the depth of the experience, like how much you're engaging with it is just, it's completely different.
That's a really great way to put it. Okay, so we've talked about how there's this decline in book reading.
Hmm.
And research seems to show that it's really like affecting how our brains are processing information, especially for, younger generations.
Yeah.
But I guess the question is why? Like what's causing this shift away from books?
Yeah, that is the million-dollar question. And
Right.
honestly, I don't think there's one simple answer. I think it's probably a bunch of things all coming together.
Yeah, I mean, it's rarely just one thing, right?
Yeah.
And, speaking of a bunch of things coming together, one thing that keeps coming up is technology. I mean, you can't talk about kids these days without talking about screens,
Yeah.
right? It's like they're fighting for our attention every second of the day,
Yeah.
not just in the classroom, everywhere.
Oh, absolutely. That pull of instant entertainment, the
Yeah.
constant notifications and updates, it's a lot to deal with. And let's be real, it's not just kids who are susceptible to that, right?
Yeah.
But to your point, it's probably not fair to just blame our devices.
Right,
But
more complicated than that.
yeah.
I've heard from a lot of teachers that standardized tests and just like the demands of the curriculum, they play a role in this too. Like there's this pressure to get through so much material so quickly to teach to the test that there's less and less time for really diving deep into those full-length books.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, it makes sense that in a system where everything's about measurable outcomes, teachers might feel like they have to go with the shorter texts and, just excerpts instead of whole novels.
Yeah. And then of course we can't forget about the elephant in the room, or I guess I should say the pandemic in the classroom. That sudden change to like all digital learning. And I mean, it was completely necessary at the time, but it really sped up how much we depend on screens, even for education. It makes you wonder if it also sped up that decline in deep reading that we were just talking about.
That's a really good point. That move toward digital learning was already happening, but the pandemic was it was like hitting fast forward on the whole thing. It might be that, because of the pandemic, we're 10 years ahead of where we would have been in terms of how much we depend on technology. And it's hard to say what the long-term effects of that will be.
Yeah, it really does feel like we're like living through this massive experiment in real time. But going back to what you said before, it's probably not any one of these things on its own. It's all of them combined, right? Like
Mm.
the perfect storm that's led us to this point where deep reading is starting to feel like, well, a little bit like an endangered species.
I think that's a great way to put it. And it actually reminds me of something that cognitive scientist Marianne Wolf said. She says that deep reading is an endangered skill. It's something we have to really work at and, protect, especially for kids these days who might not grow up surrounded by books the way that, older generations did.
Yeah, she's really got a point. If you don't develop those deep reading habits early on, it's going to be so much harder to do it later in life.
Yeah.
Can you imagine being one of those students we were talking about before, the ones who get to college and have hardly ever finished a book? That kind of deep dive into, really complex writing isn't just unfamiliar to them. It could feel downright impossible.
Exactly. And that affects way more than just, your grades in English class. Think about all the things that you learn how to do when you do a lot of deep reading, like critical thinking, empathy, understanding history. Those aren't just things you learn in school. They're really important for navigating our world today.
It's like we were saying before about that really immersive experience, right? A picture can give you some idea of what something is like, but if you really want to understand all the details, all the deeper meaning, you have to really spend some time with it. And deep reading is like that for your mind, right? It lets you completely see the world through somebody else's eyes, really think about some complex ideas, and make connections that you never would have made if you were just skimming the surface.
Absolutely. And I really hope that our listeners will think about this wherever you are in your own, reading life, even if you're like our listeners who, you actively seek out new information, you love to learn new things. Have you felt that pull away from deep reading? Have you noticed that it's a little bit harder now to really focus in on something? Because at the end of the day, the world really needs people who can think for themselves, who are okay with things being a little bit complicated, who can lose themselves in a book and, come out of it with some new ideas.
That's something we should all be thinking about. What do we lose, not just as individuals, but as a society, if we lose that ability to really get lost in a good book, to really think about those big ideas? So, listener, as you go about your day today, I'll leave you with this thought. What if you could go back and give your younger self one piece of advice about making time for reading? What would it be? And on that note, happy reading, everyone. Until next time.